afternoon and welcome back to our 24-hour global #Changing Risk Day. For those of you who have just tuned in, my name is Kinley. I'm the Content Director for Strategic Risk and I will be moderating our webinars in this part of the world. Earlier, we heard from Warren Black, who presented on the trends and challenges of Industry 4.0. Our webinar series continues to move around the world, and we've now just landed back in the UK for a presentation to be delivered by Sarah Gordon, who is the CEO of Satala, and Sarah will present on how to operationalise risk appetite and risk tolerance for day-to-day decision making. Now, before I hand over to Sarah, a short housekeeping announcement from me. Our webinar series has been designed to be interactive, and so we do encourage you to ask our speakers as many questions as possible. They have signed up to scrutiny and they are fully expecting to be quizzed, so do feel free to ask your questions by clicking on the Q&A box, which you'll find on your Zoom toolbar. This is our final presentation of the day, and all of our presentations will be published on our website, and we will notify you of when they are available. And with that, I will now hand over to Sarah Gordon.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kin. And my hat comes off to you with regards to your ability to keep this going all day. You're a true legend. And thank you very much, everybody else, for tuning in to this little webinar that we've put together for you now. As Kin has mentioned, what I will take the next 15 minutes to go through is how can a risk manager operationalise risk appetite and tolerance to support better day-to-day decision making. Now that is a true mouthful, but thank you very much, Kin, for giving me a great topic to talk through. Just by way of background, that person waving her arms around at high speed in the middle of the picture in front of you, that's me. That's in my normal environment. I am a risk manager, and I lead a team of 60 risk managers who are based around the world. We deliver a huge number of different training sessions, consultancy and research. And our real aim is to make risk management both practical and accessible. And there have been some fantastic talks over the last, I guess, almost 20 hours now that have really dived into how can we actually make this possible? How do we make sure that risk management is truly fit for purpose, both in 2019 and beyond? So risk appetite and tolerance. Usually this is something that perhaps starts off anyway, formally, within the boardroom. And the kind of conversation that certainly I often hear is somebody saying, okay, so we need to write our risk appetite statement. And then somebody else in the room says, okay, well, how about we are averse to potential threats and shall do everything we can to minimize them, yet welcome opportunities and shall actively seek them. And then somebody else says, perfect, that is something that will not only fit in the little space we have left in our annual report, but it also doesn't tell any of our competitors anything about what we're actually doing. And this is one of the main problems with risk appetite and tolerance statements, is that quite a lot of organizations have gone very vanilla, shall we say, with them. So you've got a very standard statement that doesn't actually tell you anything about what the organization's doing. And without sounding too rude, that particular statement there saying we're going to try and minimize our threats and maximize our opportunities, well, duh. Of course, that's what we're all trying to do with regards to what's going on. So what is the purpose of risk appetite and tolerance as a whole? And why would we actually want to use it? Well, firstly, it is a mechanism through which we can communicate to our stakeholders, so external to our organizations. And I think there were a number of talks earlier on today that talked about we're not just communicating with our shareholders, if we're one of those sort of organizations that indeed has shareholders, but actually now we are increasingly trying to talk to our broader stakeholders as a whole. So people who don't necessarily own parts of our organization, we need to communicate to everybody who has an interest in our organization. But also the purpose of risk appetite and tolerance really is to communicate to those within our organizations. And for that, it's actually about communicating how much freedom do they have to make their own decisions within the organization as a whole. What do we actually want them to do, and how much wiggle room are we going to give them to actually make their own decisions? Now, depending on what sort of organization we have, if we have a more command and control type business model, those are the organizations where there will typically be a very narrow range of tolerance. So very, very strict rules, perhaps, and regulations within which we need to operate. Whereas, of course, you get other organizations where there's masses of freedom and lots of tolerance for people to use their own imaginations and to explore that true range of risk tolerance as a whole. Now, I'm just going to pause for a second and try and do a bit of jargon busting, because I certainly find that when I go into organizations, very few people actually know what risk appetite and tolerance is. And in fact, every organization uses these words and interprets them or defines them in a slightly different way. Now, personally, I don't care what language anybody uses, provided we all understand what we mean within that particular meeting or within that particular organization. So to try and bust some jargon, so firstly, of course, if we have our risk universe, now lots of organizations use this in a slightly different way, but if we assume that these are all of the risks that you might face as an organization within your sector, let's say. Now within that, we've made the concerted decision to actually try and take some of those risks. So risk appetite, of course, those risks that we are willing to take. Around the outside of our risk appetite, we have this zone of tolerance. So those risks that we can take, we don't necessarily want to take them, but we can take these risks. And then, of course, around the outside of this, we have that nice red line or hard stop or red flags, whatever you want to call it, that especially financial organizations tend to call our risk capacity. So if we try and define those as being risk appetites, being that optimum point that you want to exist in, of course, there's going to be areas of uncertainty within that. Your risk tolerance, which is the zone in which you can exist, and then your risk capacity is that tipping point beyond which you need to change your strategy, or perhaps you've even gone bust. So if we take that concept of those different circles, so it can either be a solar system or a fried egg, depending on how you want to look at it. If you have a command and control type business model, then this is something here where you might have a very small risk appetite and very, very small zone of tolerance. Where, of course, if you're looking at total freedom, you have a much larger range of tolerance within which you allow your organization to operate. Now that's great, okay, and we've been drawing lovely diagrams, but how on earth do you make this actually mean something within your organization? Well, one thing that we can do is we can start articulating what do these things really look like. So at one end of our line, so on the left-hand side, we have what might be our best case scenario for an area of risk or a particular certain situation. And then over on the right-hand side, almost at the other end of the bookshelf, as it were, we have our worst case scenario. So what might that look like? Then in between those, we're going to have our risk appetite, our risk tolerance, and our risk capacity. So those will always sit somewhere between our best case scenario and our worst case scenario. And the most important aspect of this is actually that risk capacity zone, because this is that maximum level of risk that can be taken before which you actually really have to do something. And so this is where we try and take this down to that level where we can begin to measure things, or certainly we can align with regards to how do we want to articulate what does that risk appetite and capacity or tolerance really look like. Once we've actually framed these, then we can start dreaming up some lovely metrics that we can use to help us ascertain, are we moving more towards the safe zone, so our risk appetite, or are we moving out into the scary zone where we might have to make some big decisions, i.e. beyond that risk capacity. Now, so just point out at this moment, I'm sure there are lots of people who are listening to this who are looking at the way that I've defined risk appetite and tolerance and saying, no, Sarah, you need to be using risk tolerance instead of risk capacity. That's totally fine. Use whatever language you like. I've come across organizations that use every single word under the sun to define what we're looking at on this piece of paper. But just to try and describe this or bring this down to earth, perhaps into a slightly more tangible sense, if we go into the world of football or soccer, depending on how you want to call this particular game. I'm currently sitting in London in the UK, so I'm going to insist on calling this football. Yes, it's the one with the round ball, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, also known as soccer in some parts of the world. If we take a look at what might be the best case scenario, say, for the English football team, say in the World Cup Football Championship, the best case scenario for the English football team would be that the World Cup is handed to us, England, following the most exciting matches in history. Okay, so therefore we've won the tournament. Nobody in the team has been injured. None of the crowd have been injured. The crowds love us. Young players in England are inspired to play football, and our funding is secured for the foreseeable future. I should just point out at this second in time that I'm actually Scottish. So yes, this is paining me deeply to say so many wonderful things about the English football team. Anyway, moving on. So that would be the best case scenario, that England wins the World Cup. The worst case scenario is actually that we're disqualified from the tournament as a whole. This should say that I've actually assumed that England has made the cut with regards to this particular World Cup. But of course, if England were disqualified, they'd be disgraced as a team, they'd lose their funding, somebody would probably be fined, or there'd be some sort of penalties. There'd be public ridicule, players wouldn't want to play for us, and perhaps there might even be health issues in the country due to no exercise being taken within England as a whole. Because ultimately, of course, we would lose that vital match. So, best case scenario, we win. Worst case scenario, we lose. Now, sitting in between this, okay, is where we start pulling out our risk appetite through zones of tolerance. So our risk appetite is actually, we don't necessarily want the World Cup to just automatically be handed to us, okay? We know that we have to do this through winning the match, ideally within 90 minutes. And by that, I mean, we win the football match without having to go to extra time or to penalties. Because as the English football team know, England is incredibly bad when the football team has to go to penalties. Statistics show that England generally loses when we go to that stage of a football match. So we win the match in 90 minutes, which means we score more goals than the other team, we don't get any yellow or red cards, and no injuries, okay? If we go to the other end of our risk tolerance zone, you'll see there that that tipping point is what can we go to just before we lose the match and so we get kicked out of the tournament. Well, that bit just before that tipping point is we win the match following extra time and penalties, okay? We will also, at this point in time, accept as many yellow and red cards as you can give us, and we will accept lots of injuries because we've still won, and that's what we care about. Now, in this zone between that risk appetite and the outer reaches of the risk tolerance, there are lots of different metrics or indicators that we can pull in here. For example, if the opposition scores a goal, that's taking us out into the danger zone. If we score a goal, then of course we're coming back towards our risk appetite again. We can do the same thing with yellow cards, red cards, and of course injuries as well. And all of these different aspects that we're looking at here can happen at any point in time during our particular football match. Some things that are time dependent, of course, say, well, actually, if we still haven't won in our 90 minutes, then we go to extra time, then we go to penalties. And then, as some of us will know, the penalties then get extended until somebody actually wins the game. So risk appetite and tolerance with regards to a football match, your risk appetite is going to be we win, and the outer reaches of that tolerance or that tipping point is everything before we lose that match and we're out of the tournament. So if we take this back to our solar system diagram again, it's very easy when we think about this from a football perspective. But then when we go into our business perspective, sometimes you find organizations find it really difficult to align whether we have a very little tolerance for something to happen, a very small tolerance. Often these are for things like safety or bribery and corruption. You will then have risks that might have a sort of medium level of tolerance or extent of wiggle room, and other risks for which we've got lots more tolerance as a whole, okay? And that's a case where, you know, it might be a project risk, or it might be something where we're trying to invent a new piece of equipment. So therefore we need to actually allow those people within research a lot more room for failure, basically, but not too much failure, of course. Now, if I take safety, because safety is a really emotive topic, especially within many of the industries that I spend lots of time in. So I spend lots of time on mines, Originally, I'm a geologist, and mines are generally really pretty scary places from a safety perspective. Over the last, in 2018, of the top 26 mining companies in the world, 50 people lost their lives in 2018. And that's dreadful. That's for a sector that really needs to be doing more with regards to safety. Now, when you go into those organizations, you look at your best case and your worst case scenario. Best case scenario is, of course, nobody gets hurt. Worst case scenario is everybody gets hurt. Okay, so that's nice and easy to be able to define from a risk management perspective. Now, your risk appetite, again, is going to be nobody gets hurt. So that's the same as your best case scenario. Okay, so that's what we're always aiming for within any industry at all, and especially something as hazardous as mining. But then we get to our risk tolerance, and our risk tolerance is really, really difficult to be able to define, because most companies out there will talk about things like zero harm. Now, if we truly meant zero harm and we guaranteed zero, the only way that we can guarantee it really is by locking the door to those operations and handing over the keys. Because unless we take people out of those operations, we cannot guarantee absolute zero. So instead, what we do is we default to this concept of as low as reasonably practicable. And I'm sure lots of people on the line have heard of this before. It is nothing new. It's been around for a very long time. But the problem here is being able to define what does as low as reasonably practical actually mean. Does it mean that somebody can be hurt but nobody dies? Or does it mean, we only want one fatality maximum? Of course, we don't want that because we're trying to aim for zero. Or perhaps we're talking about 20% better than last year. And of course, depending on what last year looked like, 20% might be zero, or it might be 10 people losing their lives, for example. So what does this actually look like? Now, there are lots of ways in which we can measure this, okay? We've got our leading and our lagging indicators, so things like high potential incidents, recordable incidents, fatalities. But we can also use data sets like audit action closeouts, etc., as well, to be able to help us understand where are we on this continuum of people getting hurt, or potentially getting hurt, I should say, on our operations. So with this, when you're asking people, okay, where would you position your risk tolerance tipping point, or your risk capacity, or your as low as reasonably practicable, depending on how you want to phrase it, where would you put it? Would you put it at A, B, or C? Most organizations want to, of course, go for A, and that's where they say they want to be. But in actual fact, when you look at the data, they're hovering over towards the B or even the C territory because they've got fatalities or they've had people who have been hurt. Now, whilst this is lagging data or past tense data or key performance indicators, perhaps, rather than the predictive indicators that, of course, we love to use in the world of risk, it, of course, can give us a good indication of what might be the trend going on into the future. Now, when we actually see this beginning to happen, okay, this allows us to see that we're operating perhaps outside of our zone of risk tolerance. And we've got two options. We can either put in place controls to actively bring the risk to within our tolerance level, or we can change the tolerance so that B is our new tolerance rather than A. So what we've done here is we've moved the goalposts as a whole. So we either put in more time, money, effort to try and manage our risks better with regards to safety, or we say, actually, you know what, a more pragmatic objective for us to put in place here is to say, actually, we cannot bring this down to that very narrow tolerance. At this point in time, we need to accept that we may well hurt people. And so therefore, our tolerance might be much larger. Now, that is a very difficult thing for senior leaders in an organization to accept. But actually, they might be setting their organizations up for failure by not giving those mine sites, for example, or those people deeper in the organization enough resources to actually be able to manage their risks as a whole. So this then comes into how do we define the context and objectives. So this is just our normal risk management process. Of course, most risk management processes start with context and objectives of some sort. And then, of course, we go into our risk assessment, so identifying, understanding, and then evaluating our risks. For those risks we think we can manage, let's put something in place, let's manage them, let's monitor them, see if actually any of our controls are making a difference, which then takes us back up to our context and objectives again. Setting us up for that wonderful decision-making process, which says, Given the context in which we're operating and all the changes that we might be facing and the objectives that we've set ourselves, or those aims or those visions, and given the risks, be they potential opportunities or threats, and our ability to manage them, is it actually possible to achieve those objectives? If yes, great, carry on. If no, okay, we've got two options. Number one, either pump more time, money, effort into managing those risks, or number two, suck it up and change those objectives, change them to something that's a bit more pragmatic and something that you can actually deal with. And this is great because this gives us a really simple escalation tool throughout the organization, from the front line all the way up to the CEO. And as you can see here, it acts a little bit like a chain mail, perhaps, of this risk-based decision-making process flowing through the organization. And it all starts off with people understanding what are those objectives, can I actually achieve them within the tolerance levels that we have set for ourselves? If yes, great. If no, we need to do something about it, okay? Now, what can go wrong with this situation? Well, what can go wrong is where we've got this really lovely big risk tolerance zone, but then the senior leaders tell their subordinates, okay, your tolerance is slightly smaller than what I know it really is for the organization. They then tell their subordinates that their tolerance level is a little bit smaller, and so on, until you get to the people who are really doing the work and they have tiny amount of wiggle room within which to operate and within which to make their decisions. And in fact, what you're doing there is you're often stifling the organization as a whole. You can't make it work, and it's very, very difficult to operate within that. So what happens there is people try and cheat by constraining people deeper within the organization, by constraining their risk tolerance levels. You need to be able to ensure that people understand what their true tolerance is. So that's great. We've drawn lots of diagrams, but just to land this, how do we actually operationalize this appetite and tolerance concept? Well, of course, we can either go with our articulation approach, as we saw here for the football or the soccer, where we say, okay, what are we aiming at? What is the tipping point that we don't want to go beyond? And what are some of our indicators in between? Or we can use a slightly different approach, which is this risk impact and control map. Now, this map here, you can see it's been folded up many times and it's been taken around the world. What this shows us is along the x-axis, we have the potential impact of risk on our objectives. Here it is just done on a very gut feel, perhaps, way, but of course you can bring in any form of criteria you would like with regards to this as a whole. And then up the y-axis we've got, is any action required, which is basically, do we need to put more controls in place that may actually work? And up the top of that y-axis we say, yes, action is needed. And down the bottom we say, no, we don't need to do anything at all. Key within this, along the bottom with that dashed line, is that zone of tolerance, which says, okay, if our risks are sitting in there, then we'll accept them. We don't need to be doing anything else, and we can feel quite relaxed about them. We don't need to do anything beyond monitoring them. Just to give you a little indication of how this might look, we've currently got a team of Satala risk managers on the ground in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So that's that lovely big country right in the heart of Africa. It is considered quite a scary, dangerous place, and generally on country risk maps, it is coloured in deep red because it is quite a scary place to go to. But there's huge opportunity there, especially with regards to natural resources. Now, for a team visiting the DRC at the moment, one of the main risks that you might think about would be that of Ebola. So Ebola is present within the DRC. And so you can see here it is plotted all the way over on the right-hand side of our potential impact of risks on our objectives. However, there's nothing we can really do about Ebola as a team. So we either eliminate this risk by deciding not to go to the DRC, or we decide actually the place that we're going to is all the way down in the south of the country, whereas Ebola we know is all the way up more in the northeast of the country. So therefore, we're actually going to accept that risk, we're going to tolerate that risk, and we're going to say, other than continuing to monitor the situation and having an evacuation plan, there's nothing more we can do. And actually as a team, we're going to tolerate this and we're still going to go to the DRC despite the fact that Ebola is there. So there's no additional action that we want to take. But the DRC doesn't just have Ebola, it also has things like really quite scary forms of malaria and yellow fever. So this map here is a malaria map. And what we see here is so the place where the team is currently at the moment is in one of those southern areas down the bottom, one of those southern provinces that is coloured in red. And so therefore it is quite scary. And so we therefore say, okay, before anybody hits the ground and during the time that they're there, they must take malaria tablets and wear long sleeves and trousers, sleep under mosquito nets, etc. Because of course it's mosquitoes that will come and get us, and we need to monitor one another for other symptoms. And so what we can say is, provided we have those controls in place, yeah, we feel that we're managing that risk. We've brought it back within our tolerance level again, and we're going to leave people on the ground. So that's fine. We're going to carry on managing it. If though, for example, any of those risks bounce up and we feel we need to take more action, that action may well, of course, be evacuate the team from the DRC at that point in time. Now, it's not just health risks, of course. There are lots of other risks that we can plot on these maps. And what we tend to use as a team is we can prioritize our risks for action, as it were, by plotting them all on these maps. And we don't go anywhere unless we think that we can actually control them and we've delivered those actions and we've brought those risks under control. It's not just us that use them. Here's one of our clients actually using them, and you can see there's quite an in-depth discussion that is going on between the two gentlemen in the middle of the picture with regards to the prioritization of their risks. And using this is a really lovely way of using risk tolerance without actually using the words risk appetite and tolerance. You're just saying, are you managing this risk to a level that you're comfortable with? If yes, great. If no, let's go and do something about them. So in conclusion, key takeaways: risk appetite and tolerance is not just a statement written by the board for shareholders or regulators. So it's not a tick box exercise that so many organizations believe it should be. It's a method through which that degree of freedom for people within your organization, so it can be communicated to those different levels in your organization. And so therefore everybody knows where they fit, and they also get that freedom of thought and freedom of decision making no matter where they sit inside the company. Now, there are lots of different tools that can be used to do this, but the key thing is you do not need to even use the words risk appetite and tolerance. There are lots of other ways of doing it as a whole, as hopefully I've shown you either through the case study that we used for football, or of course the risk appetite and control map that we used for the likes of Ebola and malaria. So with that, I'm going to hand back to the lovely Kin and open for any questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Sarah, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm going to kick off the Q&A session by drawing on a conversation that I recently had with a risk manager about tolerance in particular. And we were talking about how do we get buy-in from all relevant stakeholders to expand the company's tolerance to take more risk and opportunity. And I guess this talks to the view that risk management isn't about sort of just managing risks. It's also about helping the company take more risks and, in other words, take more opportunity. So what's your sort of take on that, and how in a scenario where the tolerance level is low, what can be done to change that?
Yeah, so this is something here, where obviously it's a lot of organizations they still are stuck in risk management just being about managing threats rather than looking at the balance between the downside and the upside, or looking at both the threats and the opportunities that are there. And this is something where, in terms of expanding your risk tolerance to also encapsulate those opportunities that are on the table, it's about really saying, okay, if we propel ourselves forwards by a number of years, what could we look like if we took those certain opportunities? And do we think that we can actually weather those opportunities or not at the moment? So do we have enough cash reserves, for example, to be able to take that chance and to really go for them, versus just trying to minimize those threats as a whole? And this is something here where actually, by getting rid of things like likelihoods, when we're trying to measure whether risks are actually obtainable or not, can really, really help us. And we just say, actually, in terms of the impact of that risk, on what it is we're trying to do as an organization. It doesn't matter if it's positive or if it's negative. Actually, what you're saying here is how much action do we really need to take as a whole? Something that you can do with this as well in terms of trying to get people to think out of the box in terms of their risk tolerance is using things like pre or post-mortems, which is just a jargon way of doing a bit of scenario analysis. Sometimes people call it wargaming, etc. as well. There's so much jargon that's used in this field. But it's getting people to use their imagination, saying, well, what if we took that opportunity? Or what if we were the first movers with regards to this? What kind of threats might we face? What kind of opportunities would we realize if we actually took that? And that can get you to really expand on that tolerance level. And the final thing, I think, just with regards to this, is that concept of risk tolerance. It can never be zero, because otherwise we wouldn't move forwards in life at all. We have to be willing to make mistakes. We have to be willing to fail, but also be willing to succeed as well. And so therefore we need to build in wiggle room to everything that we're doing.
Excellent. I'm now going to turn to the questions from the audience. So how does one link appetite and tolerance at overall organization level, and risk exposure and residual risk exposure in risk registers across the organization and business units?
Okay, so linking risk appetite and tolerance to residual risk exposure, etc. Okay, so first, with regards to this, just in terms of jargon busting, the word residual has two definitions that I personally come across, well, at least two definitions within risk management. Some organizations define it as being, where are you right now, given the current effectiveness of your controls? And that's the most useful definition, certainly for heavy industries, etc. Some organizations define residual as being, where would you be if all of the controls that you've listed were actually working? Which is usually, if your risks are predominantly threats, is usually fairly kind of lower on your risk ranking system. Now, the methods that I've shown you here pertain to the first form of residual. And so that would be a case where we're talking about the current risk rating. So where are you right now, and how far away are you from where you want to be? So what you usually have is your risk appetite can be akin to where your risk target might be, which is something that many organizations now capture within their risk registers. So most organizations would say your risk appetite is the same as your risk target. It's not always the case, but lots of organizations do it that way. And then your current risk rating, also known by some organizations as your residual risk rating, that is, where are you in this continuum of risk tolerance? Now, hopefully, your current risk rating or your residual risk rating is within that tolerance zone. So it's within that amber zone. If you go beyond the outside of your tolerance, then that's where all of your alarms should go off. And that's your immediate trigger up through the organization to say, something's not right. We're operating outside of specification or outside of tolerance, i.e. where we want to be. We need to do something about it now. So that would be a case there where your residual rating within your risk register is telling you where are you right now on that continuum of tolerance. And what you then want to measure it against is how far away are you from your target risk or your appetite, and where are you with regards to that tipping point in terms of your risk tolerance or your risk capacity, if that makes sense. So they can all be tied together, but lots of organizations use different language to do it. And I've seen lots of organizations get rid of the words risk resilience, for example, because it's just really confusing for people deeper in the organization. And actually, to be honest, I think it's usually the board members and the senior leaders who get very confused by resilience.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to try and squeeze in another question here. How can risk managers optimize appetite and tolerance during a downturn?
So, okay, so during a downturn, so if I take the example of mining, just because we're looking at a mining picture at the moment. So mining is very much a cyclical industry. So depending on what the commodity price is doing, you can either make lots of money because you can sell whatever it is you're digging out of the ground for lots of money. And at other points in time, everybody goes bust because it costs them too much money to do it. So in that downturn, generally what you get is people tightening their belts. And so therefore they reduce the difference between your appetite and the outer edges of your tolerance to as small as possible. The problem with that is that you stifle people's imagination and innovation to actually be able to do things slightly differently during those times. And actually the companies that generally succeed a bit more are the ones that think, okay, well, actually we've gone into a slightly different business model. And so there are some areas of risk where we might actually want to take a little bit more risk, or we might want to take, have a larger zone of tolerance, because whilst we don't have the cash to spend on it, there are other ways in which we can manage those aspects. So this is something here by saying, okay, even in a downturn, there are lots of aspects of opportunity because all of your competitors are hurting. How can you do things differently, or what are the opportunities during that downturn to actually build for the upswing when it comes? It might be a case where you want to snaffle all of the lovely talent. So you might want to hire all of those people that are being laid off by other companies. And to do that, you might want to think of different ways of employing them or different ways of bringing them in. Or it might be thinking of different ways in which you can use the equipment or the assets, for example, that you have. So this is something here where you say, okay, that tolerance zone is something where you need to be able to change it. And it always changes. It's something that changes all of the time, depending on what the context is in which you're operating. And it's about saying, okay, what are we experiencing right now? What do we think we're going to experience tomorrow? What are we going to experience in 5 years? And let's plan for that, given what we've got available on the table in terms of controls and our ability to manage those risks, which is basically what your tolerance is all about.
Excellent, Sarah. Thank you ever so much for an insightful presentation and for helping us end the last 24 hours on a high. We have come to the end of this rather crazy 24 hours. And I just want to take the opportunity to say a big thank you, first and foremost, to Risk Decisions for sponsoring this series and for making this crazy initiative possible. To all of our presenters across Asia and Europe for their time, knowledge, and insight. And to everyone who has dialed in and participated, put our presenters under scrutiny. I hope you have found the last 24 hours just as useful and just as fun as I have. As I say, all of the presentations will be made available on our website, and we will be sharing the link to all of those presentations over the next week. Thank you once again. Goodbye.